They never missed a chance to remind me I was the one who didn't matter. Not when they shut the door in my face, not when they carved me out of every decision, not even when I held our family together alone. But I'm Alyssa, and the last time they tried to break me, something inside me finally broke free. The morning light slid through the adobe window in a thin, pale ribbon, brushing the room with a faint gold that never quite warmed the air. I stood by the stove, listening to the slow drip of coffee filling an old ceramic mug, the steam curling upward and mixing with the dusty scent that always came before winter settled in for good. The wall clock clicked to 7:12. I pulled on a thick sweater, checked the folder in my bag, and let my eyes fall once more on the sealed envelope sitting untouched on the table. It had arrived late the night before from the legal office where I once spent too many years. I hadn't opened it. Something about the weight of it felt heavier than paper should allow, and I wasn't ready to know why. Stepping onto the porch, I felt the bite of early snow clinging to the railing like powdered chalk. The dirt road stretching toward town was still, empty of footsteps or tire tracks. Santa Fe always carried a kind of quiet in the colder months, the kind that made it easy for secrets to stay buried. I locked the door behind me and started the car. Each gear shift let a burst of cold air slip into the cabin, keeping me awake, present. I wasn't afraid of what waited at the courthouse, but there was a tightness in my chest, an uneasy awareness that something long set aside was finally going to move. The courthouse appeared at the end of the main road, smaller than my memory allowed. Inside, my footsteps echoed against stone walls, blending with the distant hum of case numbers being called. No one looked my way, which, strangely, made it easier to breathe. I steadied myself, straightened my coat, and walked into the courtroom. Harsh white lights washed over the old wooden benches. I slid into the last row, set my bag beside me, and focused on the attorneys shuffling papers at the front. I knew what awaited me, just not the form it would take when it finally arrived. I spotted Ethan first. He sat with the same imposing posture he'd perfected over the years, broad shoulders squared, arms crossed as if he were the one presiding over the case. A thin streak of gray cut through his hair, giving him an air of seniority he wore like a badge. Beside him, Marlene adjusted the lapel of her blazer with a sharp tug, lips pressed tight in that familiar expression of someone used to directing every room she walked into. Together. They looked less like siblings in a family dispute and more like a pair of executives reviewing a contract they expected to win. Judge Harriet Monroe entered a moment later. She didn't acknowledge any of us, nor did she need to. She opened the case file with the calm of someone who had seen every version of family discord and no longer found any of it surprising. The quiet authority she carried with her filled the courtroom more completely than any speech could. The plaintiff's attorney began to speak in a steady, almost rehearsed cadence. He laid out their claim to the entire 30-some acres as if it were obvious, inevitable. According to him, I had been absent, uninvolved, undeserving. He spoke of their connection to the property with the confidence of a man sure the narrative was on his side. See, Ethan nodded along, and Marlene's expression hardened into something coldly triumphant. Then came their first move. The attorney lifted a document with a flourish, presenting it as the final legitimate will. The look Ethan and Marlene exchanged told me everything they believed the matter was already settled. I stayed silent. Observing had always served me better than speaking. Judge Monroe skimmed the will, raised one eyebrow, and placed it neatly aside. That single motion unsettled me more than any statement could have. She wasn't convinced. She was waiting for something else. A brief knock interrupted the flow of the attorney's words. A clerk approached the bench and set down a thick envelope marked with the unmistakable DOJ seal. My name was printed on the label. The air in the room shifted. Not loudly, just enough to make everyone still for a heartbeat. Judge Monroe rested her hand on the envelope without opening it. Ethan uncrossed his arms. Marlene's posture stiffened. A quiet tension rippled across the courtroom, the kind that warns everyone that whatever comes next will change the direction of everything. And in that small, suspended moment, I knew this wasn't going to unfold the way they had planned. Judge Monroe picked up a letter opener and slid it along the envelope in one clean stroke. the sound sharp enough to cut through the room's hush. Ethan straightened, almost involuntarily. Marlene's fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt. She pulled out a stack of papers substantially thicker than I expected and turned to the first page. Bold black letters stretched across the header, Perkins St. B. Confidential. A whisper stirred through the room and vanished just as quickly when she moved to the next page and stopped. The pause felt heavy, deliberate. Her eyes lifted briefly and met mine, and in that fleeting second, something shifted. She had seen something neither side expected. A knot tightened inside my chest. I had assisted in DOJ analyses before, but I had never imagined anything from that world would appear here, in a dispute over my family's land. The judge set the file down and spoke with quiet finality. The court will recess for 30 minutes. No elaboration, no acknowledgement of the shock spreading across the plaintiff's table. When she rose, I noticed a faint tremor in her hand, not fear, but recognition of the weight the file carried. Ethan's head snapped toward me. His confidence cracked. Marlene leaned back slightly, as if distance might soften the impact of whatever came next. I stayed still, though my heart pounded hard enough to echo in my ears. In that single suspended moment, past and present collided with a force I hadn't anticipated but could no longer avoid. I stepped out of the courtroom and leaned against the cold stone wall, letting the mix of old wood, worn paper, and weak hallway coffee pull me backward into years I never meant to revisit. It was strange how a smell could drag up memories I had spent half my life burying, but there they were, surfacing in sharp, unforgiving detail. When we were children, Ethan and Marlene were spoken of as bright futures waiting to happen. They were sent to better schools, given tutors, praised for everything they did. I, on the other hand, was handed responsibility disguised as duty. I cooked meals. I cleaned rooms. I tended to whichever parent was sick. I kept the house running while they stepped into lives paved with opportunity. I didn't protest because I thought devotion meant doing everything without expecting anything back. There was only one time my mother apologized. She was in a hospital bed, drifting in and out of clarity, and she looked at me with eyes that felt both familiar and distant. She whispered something soft, a half-formed regret. She couldn't recall my name. That moment carved a place inside me I never allowed anyone to see. I lost my university scholarship because someone had to stay home with my father. Ethan promised he'd make it up to me once he found his footing in Denver, but that promise evaporated the moment he settled into his new life. Marlene told me staying close to home was the right decision for someone like me, her voice gentle but heavy with expectation. When I finally left Santa Fe before sunrise, no one came out to the porch. No one asked where I was going. I built my life in Los Angeles, then in a justice organization where documents mattered more than people. I analyzed papers with a precision that came from years of reading the unspoken: signatures, dates, margins, typefaces. I learned to see truth hiding in the smallest details. That training came rushing back when I recognized the forged signature their attorney had presented. My pulse jumped because it wasn't unfamiliar. It was the exact kind of deception I had dissected in another case years ago. That was when I realized Perkins 17B was no accident. And then the deeper jolt: my name had been used as a coded reference in several significant analyses. I never expected that alias to resurface in a case tied to my own blood. The hallway began to fill as other cases spilled out. I straightened, adjusted my coat, and drew in a steady breath. It was time to return. The air in the courtroom had changed by the time I stepped back in. Ethan's confidence had drained, leaving him rigid and uneasy. Marlene sat with her back unnaturally straight, like a student waiting to be called on for an answer she didn't have. Judge Harriet Monroe placed the Perkins 17B file neatly before her and slid her glasses higher up her nose. Her voice was calm, almost clipped, as she resumed the proceedings. The first page she read had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with the land and inquiry into a suspicious mortgage attempt from the previous year. Ethan flinched at the mention, and a murmur rippled through the plaintiff's table. She turned another page, and the shift in the room became palpable. A different will, legitimate, properly witnessed, stored in federal records, listed only one heir. The courtroom froze at the sound of my name. Then came the investigator's notes. concerns about Ethan's financial behavior, a directive that the land not be divided, a final line stating that the property should remain solely with me due to reliability. Marlene's breath caught. Ethan stared at his attorney as if hoping for an explanation he knew wasn't coming. Judge Monroe set down one last document, a mortgage signed under my father's name, on a day he was lying helpless in an ICU bed. I remembered that night the machines, the strained whisper he tried to form before the ventilator drowned everything else. My eyes burned, but I kept them steady. Ethan lurched to his feet, shouting that it was fabricated, but the judge silenced him with a strike of her gavel. The room fell into a dense, breathless quiet. And beneath that stillness, I felt the ground shift again, this time unmistakably in my favor. The courtroom felt heavier when we reconvened, as if the air itself sensed what was coming. I sat straighter, hands clasped in my lap, steadying my breath while Judge Harriet Monroe turned through the Perkins 17B file with deliberate precision. Each page she flipped seemed to drag another secret into the light. Then she looked at me. "Ms. Perkins, please stand." I stood, aware of Ethan's glare cutting into my back. Judge Monroe began outlining my past work in federal investigations, describing the analyses I had conducted that contributed to uncovering significant financial misconduct. Her tone didn't waver. It didn't need to. Marlene let out a faint, disbelieving laugh, only to be met with a cold warning from the bench that wiped the color from her face. Their attorney rushed in, dismissing the DOJ documents as irrelevant. Judge Monroe ignored him and turned another page. A signature report, one I had written years ago, connected indirectly to the company where Ethan once worked. My breath hitched. I had never known our professional worlds had crossed without my awareness. Marlene's eyes swung toward Ethan, frantic. He refused to look back. Judge Monroe continued, listing debts tied to Ethan from the period when our father was hospitalized, including an attempt to mortgage the family land. The murmurs rising through the courtroom made my pulse spike. I didn't feel vindicated, only tired. All the roads seemed to lead to the same truth. I had never mattered to them as much as what they wanted. Then she delivered the blow. Officers were ordered to seize the original documents from Ethan's office. Ethan erupted, insisting it had nothing to do with the case. But the judge cut through his panic with the simple, brutal reminder that it involved my father, the man he had forged. The room fell silent, shattered and raw. A cold wave swept the courtroom. Ethan slumped into his chair. Marlene gripped the bench as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Judge Monroe presented two signatures. The forged one my siblings submitted, and the real one taken from a legitimate transaction. The difference was undeniable. A handwriting expert confirmed the forgery with calm precision. Marlene's outburst was silenced with a single strike of the gavel. Then came the next blow, an internal email from Marlene's former law firm, stating clearly that if I didn't appear, they were to file the alternate will. Her face drained as whispers spread across the room. Judge Monroe laid out the final revelation. Years earlier, during an unrelated investigation, a federal agent had stored a copy of my family's real will because of a suspicious transaction linked to Ethan. My father, even in his final years, had tried to shield me in the only way he could. The judge read the investigator's note. Alyssa Perkins is the only one who maintained integrity. The land should stay with her. Silence collapsed over the courtroom. Ethan bowed his head. Marlene broke into quiet sobs, and I felt the truth finally settle where it had always belonged. No one in the courtroom seemed to breathe when Judge Harriet Monroe placed the Perkins 17B file on the bench once more. She removed her glasses and set them neatly along the edge of the stack. The gesture careful, almost reverent, as though she were arranging a piece of someone's life that needed to be honored. Maybe it was mine. My hands stayed folded, but my fingers trembled despite my effort to keep still. The judge's eyes swept over Ethan first, then Marlene, and finally landed on me. "Everyone, please rise." Chairs scraped back in unison, the sharp sound reverberating through the room like falling stone. Judge Monroe stood tall. The rarity of that alone sent a ripple of surprise through nearly every person present. "Before this court delivers its ruling," she said, "I will read one final section from the Perkins 17B file." She turned to the last page, her voice deepening with the weight of someone who had witnessed too many lives warped by greed. In federal asset investigations, Ms. Perkins consistently demonstrated integrity, even at personal cost. Her analyses were thorough and accurate, protecting millions in public funds. I swallowed slowly. Years of unspoken effort, work done in silence, without praise or acknowledgement, were suddenly spoken aloud before the very people who had never believed I was capable of anything. The judge continued. Regarding the matter of her family's land, the investigator determined that only Alyssa Perkins was fit to inherit according to her parents' original intent. Ethan went rigid. Marlene broke into uncontrollable sobs. Their attorney lowered his head, hands trembling. I remained still, not victorious, not defeated, just standing within the truth of my own name. Judge Monroe closed the file. Ms. Perkins, this court recognizes your integrity. Today, justice stands with you. Then she gave me a small nod, not a smile, not sympathy, understanding. And in that quiet gesture, I realized I hadn't been waiting for validation only for someone, once in my life, to acknowledge that my silence had never meant insignificance. We sat again, the room tightening around us until it felt stripped of air. Judge Monroe lifted her gavel, adjusted the microphone, and spoke with a resonance that rolled through the courtroom like stone shifting in a deep cavern. The will submitted by the plaintiffs is inviolate. The will contained in Perkins 17B is legally recognized. The sole rightful heir is Alyssa Perkins. Each sentence landed with the weight of a window being pried open after years of being nailed shut. Light where there had only been dust. Then came the rest. Ethan Perkins is recommended for prosecution under statutes regarding the exploitation of an individual unable to legally consent. Marlene Perkins is to be reviewed for charges of collusion, document concealment, and deliberate misrepresentation. Marlene collapsed into her hands. Ethan pressed his fingers into his forehead, his breath sharp and uneven, like he was trying to swallow the consequences he never thought would reach him. I didn't turn to look at them. There was no triumph in this moment. Only exhaustion, the deep, bone-level kind that comes after walking too long through the dark. Their attorney tried to interject, but Judge Monroe cut him off without hesitation. We are finished here. The gavel struck wood, final and cold. It echoed like the end of a long, painful chapter of my life. A clerk approached, speaking softly near my shoulder. Ms. Perkins, the investigative office will need your signature on a few documents confirming the origin of the Perkins 17B materials, but you're free to go whenever you're ready. I nodded. Then I rose and walked out. The heavy wooden doors closed behind me, sealing in Marlene's broken sobs and Ethan's ragged breathing. As I moved through the hallway, narrow windows spilled slivers of light onto the floor, the brightness catching on dust in the air. Something inside me shifted quiet, sudden like a knot pulled tight for years, finally snapping loose, for the first time in a long time. I let myself think one simple truth. It's finally over. By the time I reached my adobe home in Santa Fe, the day had begun its slow descent into color. The sun slipped behind the Sangre de Cristo foothills, pouring shades of red and violet across the sky's soft, solemn hues that felt like they were settling directly into my chest. A cold wind threaded through the tall cottonwoods, their branches creaking in that familiar way I used to hear every night when my father was still alive. I paused at the wooden gate, running my fingers over the weathered grain. I felt the chill seep into my skin, but this time it didn't bite. It steadied me, grounded me. I pushed the gate open and stepped onto the land my parents had tended with quiet devotion, land they had intended for me long before any court ever declared it. Land that had waited, patiently, for me to come home. Kicking off my shoes, I climbed the porch steps and lowered myself into the old wooden chair by the railing. The evening breeze moved through my hair, carrying the scent of dust, dry leaves, and something else, something like the beginning of a life I had put on hold for far too long. I thought about the moment the judge rose from her bench, about the years I spent being treated as if I were invisible, a background presence in my own family, about my mother's eyes in that hospital bed, part memory, part forgetting, and the apology she never had the strength to voice, but that I finally understood anyway. I rested my hand over my heart. Slowly. Warmth spread beneath my palm. Thawing places inside me I hadn't realized were still frozen. It wasn't the judge standing that saved me. It wasn't the Perkins 17B file. It wasn't even the legitimate will that returned this land to me. It was the simple truth that I had finally stood up from years of being diminished, stood up from the weight of being the reliable one only when it was convenient for others, stood up from the shadow of the forgotten child. I exhaled deeply, letting the wind take the remnants of what I no longer needed to carry. The sky shifted into deep indigo. The first star blinked awake above the ridge. A new day was waiting just beyond the horizon, and for the first time in years, I was ready to walk toward it, 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 ready to walk toward it.